Hello, Dave here with your definitive guide to gravel and adventure bikes. With the help of this GT grade, I'm going through all the key features and details on one of these bikes and how they are different to a regular drop bar road bike to make sure you're fully informed if you're in the market for one of these bikes in 2020. The first place to start, and it's the most obvious one, are the tyres. Now, gravel bikes have much wider tyres than any road bikes, and they also, as you can see, have blocks on. Basically, they're like mountain bike tyres that have been on a diet and have been shrunken down to fit a drop bar road bike. Now, two key things to know about a gravel and adventure tyre. One is the width, and the second is the tread pattern. And both are dictated by the terrain you're riding on and your riding style, whether you're racing or doing bike packing adventures. Generally speaking, a road bike maxes out at about 30 or 32 millimeters in some cases, while a cyclocross bike is governed by UCI rules and they are maxed out at 33 millimeters wide for UCI World Cup races. But gravel and adventure bikes have a much wider range, and you're generally looking at between 35 at the narrowest, right up to 50, 55, even 60 millimeters in some cases. And in some cases, you can actually fit mountain bike tyres to a gravel and adventure bike. When it comes to choosing tyre width, generally the wider the tyre, the smoother ride. A bigger volume of air between you and the ground, the roots and the rocks that you're riding over, and you run lower pressures and just benefit from a smoother ride. The other key thing to look for in a gravel tyre is the tread pattern, and the tread pattern again is dictated by your riding style and the terrain you're riding on. Now, generally speaking, if you're riding hard packed trails, roads and very fine dirt, you can get away with a faster rolling tread pattern with low profile blocks, more of a semi-slick tyre. But if you're dealing with mud and looser conditions, you're going to want a slightly more aggressive, taller tread pattern to give you a bit more traction and purchase in those slipperier conditions. Now, I know what it's like. Choosing a new tyre can be a daunting experience. With so much choice, it can be confusing to know where to start. So a good starting point is an article that I published on Red Bull recently. They asked me to choose my 10 favourite tyres, so I linked to that in the description down below, and that's a good starting point because I picked some of my favourite tyres that I've actually ridden over the last few years. Tyres for different conditions, from dry to mud, and why you might want to choose a different tyre. These tyres, by the way, are WTB's Riddler, 37 millimeters wide, and they strike a good balance. They're fast rolling on the road and hard pack, and reasonably grippy when it's a bit looser and muddier. Now, tubeless is an essential, in my opinion, for going off-road. It minimises the risk of pinching when you squash the tyre between the rim, which with an in-tube can pinch the in-tube. So tubeless just lets you ride without the risk of punctures, and you can benefit from low pressures. So definitely go tubeless. These tyres, these rims are tubeless ready, so going tubeless couldn't be easier. Geometry is something else that is really important on a gravel and adventure bike, and what separates them from a drop bar road bike or cyclocross bike. Now, generally speaking, you're looking at a longer wheelbase than a road bike and a slacker head angle to give more stability and a calmer steering bike when you're dealing with rough tracks and loose gravel, just so it's not quite twitchy or nervous as a race bike. The bottom bracket, and therefore the cranks and the pedals, are higher than a road bike but lower than a cyclocross bike, so you get more ground clearance, but you're not perched on top of the bike as you are on a cyclocross bike. So the position between the saddle and handlebars feels more like an endurance road bike. Another small detail is often the stack or the head tube is higher than a road bike, so the position is not quite as aggressive, it's not quite as head down at the front. So you want the handlebars a little bit higher, easier to reach, so when you're riding very technical terrain, you're not perched right over the front of the bike. It just feels a bit easier to manage on tricky terrain. While we're talking about geometry, it's also worth pointing out that many gravel and adventure bikes, like this one here, have a shorter stem. That's to bring the handlebars a bit closer to you, just so you can handle the bike easier on twisting trails. The idea of these changes to geometry compared to a road bike and a cyclocross bike is to make them easier to handle, to manage off-road when you're dealing with loose gravel and technical descent. So you've got handling that's more laid back, more relaxed, not quite as flighty or nimble or agile as a road bike. Because when you're dealing with fast descents and loose gravel, you want the steering to be a bit slower, bit more laid back, and those changes that are key to look for in a gravel bike. Now, something else I don't want to get into too much detail, but it's worth mentioning, is that we're seeing some manufacturers do two things with their gravel bikes. One is that some manufacturers are moving further away from the road bike DNA that started with these bikes to mountain bikes, and we're seeing some bikes with longer top tubes, longer front centres and very short stems. So that's a mountain bike influence. And the other, as you can see with the GT Grade, is they are experimenting with different fork offsets to affect the trail of the bike. Now, for a long time, road cyclists have not had to worry about fork offset or trail or even know what it is. So in a future video, I'll do a more detailed explanation. If you want that, let me know down below. Now, the idea of adjusting the fork offset and the trail is to change your handling depending on what size wheels and tyres you are putting on the bike to allow the rider to customise the handling of the bike to a small degree. With the Grade, GT's idea was to increase the speed of the handling and the steering when you put loads of weight on the bike, when you're going bike packing. So you've got a big seat pack, a frame pack and a handlebar bag that adds weight and it slows down the steering. So they've adjusted the trail, so when you're going bike packing, you can just speed up the handling and get it back to where it is, unladen, without extra weight on the bike. So an interesting detail on a bike. I mean, you don't have to touch it, you can just leave it as it is if you want, but it's a feature we're seeing coming up on a lot more gravel and adventure bikes, and that'll be a recurring theme going forward. The other really important thing on a gravel and adventure bike is gearing. Now, generally speaking, you have much lower range gearing to help you when you're going up very steep off-road climbs, or if you're going bike packing, you've got extra weight on a bike and you need low gears to help you on the climbs. Now, we see two options in the gravel world, 1x or 2x, and which you choose comes down to personal preference, and there are pros and cons to both. This GT Grade, as you see, has a 2x, which you're fairly familiar with, and the important detail is the size of the chain rings, and they're much smaller than a road bike. So we have a 46 tooth big ring and a 30 tooth inner chain ring, so much smaller than a compact or semi-compact or a standard chain set on a road bike. So that chain set combined with the 1134 cassette on the back gives you much lower gears when you're dealing with off-road terrain or you're going bike packing with extra weight that you can put on a bike. Now, the other option is 1x, and 1x basically means one single chain ring. It's a mountain bike technology originally, and the idea is to get rid of the front mech, the two chain rings, have one single chain ring, and it offers more simplicity. While you can get the same overall range on a 1x as you do on a 2x here, the one common pitfall is the bigger steps between the sprockets on the back. You usually have much bigger cassettes. Now, SRAM offers a massive 1050 mountain bike cassette, which you can put on a road bike, which offers all the range, or more range in some cases than a 2x, but it does mean much bigger gaps between some of the sprockets on a cassette, which can be an issue for some people if you like to be in a perfect cadence all the time, but generally off-road it's not such a problem as it is on the road. One key word with gravel and adventure bikes is versatility, and it's something you see on a lot of bikes, and it does depend from brand to brand. Some are super versatile and some are not so much. Generally speaking, a gravel bike designed for racing, like a Cervelo Aspero, has less versatility baked into it, whereas this GT Grade is a great example of a bike with loads of versatility. And that basically means this bike can be turned to many different uses, from commuting to touring to audax to gravel racing, bike packing. There's loads of uses that this bike can be turned to. So being versatile basically means lots of eyelets and mounts for racks and water bottles and other things you might want to stick on your frame for going bike packing and adventure riding. So in this case, we've got mudguard eyelets, so great for winter road riding. We've got 2 bolts on the top tube for a small food bag. We actually have 3 bolts on the fork for putting an extra water bottle or a rack on there, so that's a useful detail if you're going extreme bike packing. And as well as 2 bottle cage mounts inside the front triangle, there's a 3rd bottle cage on the bottom of the down tube. It goes without saying really that most, if not all, gravel and adventure bikes have disc brakes on these days. So gravel and adventure bikes adopted disc brakes from the start really, and the main reason is, well, 2 things. It's control when you're dealing with very tricky trails and riding through all conditions, and it also more easily allows bigger tyre clearance than rim brakes. So disc brakes are a common feature on most gravel and adventure bikes. Cheaper entry-level bikes will have cable-operated disc brakes, but if you can afford them, hydraulic disc brakes are the best option. Much more control, and the longevity of them is excellent. So disc brakes, common feature on gravel and adventure bikes, not really worth talking about anymore because disc brakes are sweeping through the road bike world anyway. Something else that's becoming an important consideration on many gravel and adventure bikes, and its grade is a good example, is comfort. Ride a road bike down a gravel track or some pavé and it's a pretty brutal and horrible experience really, which is why most road rides stay on the road because it's smoother and more enjoyable. Wide tyres go a long way to providing more comfort, which is why wide tyres and lower pressures enabled by tubeless is a key thing to improve the comfort of a gravel and adventure bike when you're riding off-road. But some bike designers are going a step further, and this GT grade just helps to illustrate my point really nicely. You'll have spotted by now the really skinny rear stays. They were introduced on the original Mark 1 GT grade back in 2014, 2015, and they are fiberglass, solid fiberglass cores wrapped in carbon fiber, and they were designed to flex. Now, to increase the amount of flex and the bending force at the seat post, they've detached them from the seat tube, and the seat tube itself is shaped to ensure that these skinny rear stays can bend a lot more. So when you're riding over rough tracks, the seat post and the saddle can flex back and forth, and that flexing motion just helps to take the edge off rough impacts. And it really does work. When you're riding along rough tracks, you can see the saddle moving back and forth, and you can feel it moving back and forth, not in a bad way, but enough to just provide a smooth ride. Other companies are taking different approaches as well. Trek has a Checkpoint, which takes the ISOSpeeder coupler from its Domane endurance bike and does a similar job to the grade, but a slightly more complex design which separates the seat post from the rest of the frame. Another design is the Specialized Diverge, which takes the Future Shock, the small spring from the Roubaix, and helps to isolate the handlebar from all the bumps and vibration coming through the front wheel. And that does work really well. I tested a previous generation 2014, 2015 Diverge, and I'll put a link to my review up in the card above and down in the description. And that bike, if you want a smooth ride when it comes to dealing with all the impacts that come through the handlebar, does an excellent job. Another even more extreme bike is the Lauf, or Loof, depending on how you want to pronounce it, with a mad carbon fibre fork with fiberglass leaf springs, which provides 20 or 30 millimeters of suspension travel and just allows the front wheel to come up and down over bumps. I used that at Dirty Reaver a few years ago, and it really did help on really long, sustained gravel tracks. It just filters out a lot of the vibration, the buzz that comes through the handlebars, and reduces fatigue a lot, which is part of the challenge of reducing fatigue on very long gravel events where your upper body, your arms get pretty battered from riding over gravel on a rigid carbon or steel frame. Another bike to consider if you want a smooth ride and a really interesting design solution is the Cannondale Topzone Carbon. And I got to ride this bike at a launch last year, and they've dropped the rear stays, and where those rear stays connect to the seat tube, that is small pivots, cartridge bearings, and that is designed to increase the amount that the rear stays can flex up and down. And they say it allows up to 30 millimeters of up and down movement, which is quite staggering. And it does work. It does provide a smooth ride on washboard gravel. But what it needs is something at the front, maybe a lefty from the now discontinued Slate, or even a head shot like they used to do back in the 90s. So it definitely needs something up the front to provide a more balanced feel front to rear. So there we go then, some useful pointers and tips if you're buying a new gravel and adventure bike this year. Now, if you have any further questions, don't be afraid to get down in the comment section below and type away, and I'll do my best to answer them. But that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button and give me a big thumbs up. And if you really enjoyed it, maybe subscribe to my channel. Loads more bike reviews, loads more tech how-to coming up, so make sure you stick around. But that's all for now. Thank you for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you again next time.